the panel discussion. I apologize for being a few minutes late, but the previous sessions were running a little bit over time. As you know, this panel discussion is going to address the NAFTA Chapter 11 process, the investment dispute process, and we have a terrific panel. Three people who are eminently qualified to discuss the issue. They've all had exposure to and experience in investment disputes in various ways. Now, in your program, you have the biographies of each of these individuals, and I'm not going to read what you can read yourselves in the program, other than to introduce them very briefly. We're going to start the discussion on Chapter 11 with Robert Wisner, and Robert practices directly in this area with Appleton and Associates. He knows the rules, he knows the law, he knows his way around Chapter 11. He's had many cases involving Chapter 11, so there's none better qualified to address some of the issues that are under discussion now. David Orchard will follow, and as you know, David is, well, among other things, he's from Saskatchewan, so he and I share the same provinces, our native provinces. David has written widely on Chapter 11 issues. I think you know he has a particular political point of view, which he'll be sharing with us. But he has examined the investment dispute provisions and written on them, and we will benefit from his particular viewpoint. Jim McElroy, an old friend, and a well-known Toronto trade lawyer, Toronto-based trade lawyer, has also written widely on the investment dispute provisions, and he has practiced in the trade law field for many, many years. And Jim is well known as the leading member of the Canadian Trade Bar. So we have a highly qualified panel. What they've agreed to do is to limit their comments to about 10 or 12 minutes, and I'll be monitoring in order to get their presentation done succinctly and pointedly, and then to allow for discussion, because these kinds of sessions benefit from interchange and discussion. And so you'll have ample opportunity to lob them with the most difficult, penetrating questions you can think of. So let's start with Robert Wisner for this afternoon's session. Robert.
Thank you, Larry. I was asked to talk about the future of NAFTA Chapter 11, and I decided that other people will probably talk about the future of NAFTA Chapter 11. I thought I would instead talk about the past. I would talk about the history of NAFTA Chapter 11 and try to see a little bit about how we got to where we are today with this highly controversial treaty provision. And there's two reasons why I think it's important to understand a little bit about the history of NAFTA Chapter 11. The first reason is that it's important to know that this treaty provision was not kind of dreamed up at the last minute during the negotiations for NAFTA and inserted secretly by multinational corporations. This treaty provision is one of 2,100 plus similar treaty provisions around the world. Just about every country in the world today, with the exception of a few places like North Korea and Libya are party to at least one bilateral investment treaty. Canada is a party to 20 other treaties that are very similar to NAFTA. That's the first reason to talk a little bit about the history. The second is, I think, in order to understand where we're going with NAFTA Chapter 11 and other bilateral investment treaties, I think you need to know a little bit about what the past is, because only if you understand the past will you be able to see where the future is going. And my remarks dovetail a little bit with some of Larry's points during his luncheon presentation. And while I absolutely agree with the fundamental points, I do think that my discussion may add a little bit of qualification on some of these remarks, because one of the things that we see in the history of NAFTA Chapter 11 is that international law has not always strictly been about pure state-to-state disputes. And in fact, if we look at the characteristics of NAFTA Chapter 11, I think we can identify a handful of distinctive salient characteristics. One is the fact that it allows foreign investors to sue the host state under international law rather than the state's own domestic law. The second key factor is that the federal government is responsible in international law for the actions of all subnational levels of government. That means that measures, and Larry talked a little bit about what a measure is at lunch today, measures by provincial governments and even municipal governments can trigger liability for the federal government. A third key feature is that claims are decided by ad hoc tribunals. And these tribunals are not necessarily nationals of the host state. They are often nationals of the investor state or even nationals of other states. And that's not surprising, because after all, they're not applying Canadian law, they're applying international law. So when you look at these features of NAFTA Chapter 11, you have to ask yourself, well, how has the world ever seen anything quite like this before? And the answer is yes, it has. And it's seen it for quite some time, going at least as far back to the Jay Treaty of 1794. Now, the Jay Treaty was a treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom, and it settled a number of issues arising in the American Revolution. One of the issues it settled was Canada's border with the United States. Another issue that it dealt with, though, was claims that British subjects who remained loyal to the Crown during the American Revolution had against the United States of America. And it established an arbitration tribunal to deal with those claims. And that arbitration tribunal was there to decide those claims under international law. Now, of course, many British subjects who remained loyal to the Crown came to what is now Canada. And so I'd like to say that in some ways the history of Canada is intertwined, I think, with the history of international investment law and arbitration. This kind of system of having a panel of international arbitrators resolve disputes brought to them by nationals, foreign nationals, and about actions of the host state was copied throughout the 19th and 20th century in what are called mixed claims tribunals. And there were mixed claims tribunals that were set up to decide other issues between the United States and the United Kingdom. Some of those tribunals rendered awards against the United Kingdom, which was at the time the world's largest superpower, and in fact was held liable for what were at the time substantial amounts of damages for breaches of international obligations. This was picked up again as recently as the International Mixed Claims Tribunal, or the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal, set up in 1980 to resolve the Iran-U.S. hostage crisis. That crisis was resolved through the Treaty of Algiers, where the hostages were returned to the United States. The United States released funds belonging to Iran that were frozen during the hostage crisis, but it held back a reserve, and that reserve was used to compensate American nationals who brought claims before the Iran U.S. Claims Tribunal for expropriation of property in Iran. So that's a little bit of the background of all of these international claims tribunals that have established what Larry referred to as sources of law. They're very rich sources of law. Some of them are very old, and but they constitute part of the what political international lawyers call the acquis of NAFTA Chapter 11. Now, that is not to say that nothing has changed. What NAFTA Chapter 11 did, and other bilateral investment treaties before it did, is that it created a standing right of investor-state arbitration, which was a little bit distinctive from what we had in the mixed claims tribunals. Mixed claims tribunals were essentially backward-looking and were there to resolve disputes that are fairly widespread civil unrest. Forward-looking protections existed in a lot of treaties, called friendship, commerce, and navigation treaties, but generally only states could bring claims under those treaties. And if you were a foreign national that had been harmed by the conduct of the state, you would have to go to your home state and ask them to exercise their right of diplomatic protection. And that state would then decide whether or not to pick up your claim and bring it to, for example, the International Court of Justice, as the U.S. did in the case of Italy. And there were lots of political considerations that factored into that. Needless to say, if you were a small business and you were dealing with a state that had an interest in maintaining friendly relations with another state and did not want to take that state to court, you would have a pretty hard time in convincing your government to exercise its right of diplomatic protection. Investment treaties, starting in the 1960s, started to get around that by having the governments basically agree in advance to allow investors to essentially step into their shoes and bring their claims under international treaties before arbitration tribunals. And although those treaties started in the 1960s, they didn't get really signed a lot until the 1990s, only then did they start to have a critical mass. And as a result, only now are we starting to witness the blossoming, I guess, of investor-state arbitration as a growing area of international law practice. And for those of you that are students here studying international law, I think that you'll find it a very interesting area because some of the issues that Larry talked about that are new issues for the WTO, such as review of the conduct of administrative agencies and tribunals, are actually very old issues in international investment law. Going back to, again, the early 19th century, we see international treaties, treaty tribunals, evaluating whether, for example, aliens have been denied justice in local courts, or whether they've been subject to other forms of procedural unfairness at the hands of administrative agencies. And the challenge, I guess, today is to see how we modernize that very old body of law and how we apply it in the context of the modern regulatory state. And given that I have 2 minutes, I think I'll probably just wrap up there, and I'm going to hold back any comments about more controversial substantive and procedural issues surrounding NAFTA for the question period. If any of you would like to ask some questions about those, I'd be happy to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the organizers of this event, Robert, Zed, and the others who made this event happen. I'm not a lawyer, so
that's an advantage.
I have a little different take. I'm not making a living off these treaties, so I'm going to have a very different take than Mr. Wisner had, except in one sense. I too am not going to start by talking about the future of these agreements. I'm going to talk about where they came from, because I agree with you that that's what we have to know before we can move too far about the future. But since the 1940s, and I'm going to go a little farther back than you did, Robert, Canada's traded with the United States and the rest of the world under the GATT agreement, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Some 100-odd countries around the world belong to that in a multilateral forum. The United States began a push in the 1970s on a whole number of fronts to change these treaties. They weren't getting what they wanted in the multilateral forum, so they decided to start individual bilateral treaties. They did their first one with Israel in 1983 and then moved to secure an agreement with Canada. In Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign in 1980, he called for a free trade zone from the Arctic Circle to Tierra del Fuego. And since Confederation and before, Canada had always opposed the idea of free trade with the United States. John A. Macdonald famously called free trade in our first free trade election in 1891. He called it treason because he said it meant giving control of our nation to a foreign power. He said, what would Canada do if it threw away its economic independence? The next to go would be its political independence. And that, of course, our next free trade election was 1911. Again, the Conservatives, this time under Robert Borden, opposed free trade with the United States, and we built an east-west economy that defied the pull of our powerful neighbor. And in 1983, of course, Brian Mulroney, running for the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party, said, don't talk to me about free trade, that's a danger to Canadian sovereignty. But when he got into power, he reversed his position and that of the Progressive Conservative Party and negotiated this Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which is a major document. I wrote a book on it. It's on the table at the back, and so I'm just going to talk about a couple of the key provisions. The energy sector, for example, provides that even if we face a shortage in Canada, we will continue to send the same proportion of any energy goods south of the United States that we were sending before the shortage. Right now we're sending about 60% of our oil and gas south of the United States, and under the terms of this treaty, if and when we run out, we would still be committed to send 60% south, and furthermore, we can never charge American companies more than the Canadian companies. So I'm not aware of any nation anywhere in the world that has signed away its energy resources in such a sweeping way. The investments section of the agreement said that we cannot screen or restrict U.S. investment, new U.S. investment coming into Canada, and we've seen over 12,000 Canadian companies taken over by U.S. owners since the agreements were signed. We have fewer than a dozen major widely held Canadian companies left listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. You know, out west, we know Liddell, the biggest company in British Columbia, taken over by Warehouse or West Coast Transmission by Duke Petroleum. Like to move all the way across the country. Even the Bay, our last retailer, is in negotiations now that may well end up with it in U.S. hands. But in 1993, we expanded the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement to include Mexico. That NAFTA agreement is an even more complicated document, 1,100 pages plus annexes. And I'm certainly not going to talk about all of the 1,100 pages, but one of the key sections is against energy. And Mexico refused to sign the energy part that Canada had signed. They said their energy was too important for them to sign it away, so they got an exemption on energy. So now we've got a situation where Mexico has a national energy policy. The United States, as we all know, has a national energy policy with its goals to promote energy independence, as Mr. Bush said in his State of the Union address. And Canada, the coldest country of all, can no longer have a national energy policy because we've signed away these resources under this agreement in a way that Mexico, with a much weaker bargaining hand, refused to do. For us, energy is not a luxury. It's something that we need to survive. We once had, before we signed these trade agreements, a provision that our natural gas companies had to show that there's 25 years future supply in the ground for Canadian use before any more could be exported. So this brings me to Chapter 11 of NAFTA. For the first time in a bilateral agreement, we've given the right of private American and Mexican companies to sue the Canadian government directly for any law or regulation in this country that they feel causes them loss or damage, and which they feel contravenes the spirit and terms of NAFTA. Prior, as Robert mentioned, governments had to challenge each other, but now U.S. corporations have more power in Canada than Canadian companies, because Canadian companies cannot sue the Canadian government if they don't like a law or regulation, but U.S. and Mexican companies have. And just to look briefly at how this has worked, there's been several NAFTA cases, most of them, Chapter 11 cases, most of them on the environment. The Ethel case was one of the first, and the Ethel case, the Ethel Corporation of Virginia makes an additive to gasoline called MMT. MMT replaced lead in gasoline when lead was found to be causing problems. In opposition, Mr. Chrétien called MMT a insidious neurotoxin. California banned it, Europe wouldn't allow it, and so the Liberal Party in 1998 banned the importation and transportation of MMT into Canada. Ethel responded by suing the Canadian government for $347 million. The Canadian government said, we have a sovereign right to protect our citizens' health, and we're going to do that. But they rapidly backed off. They signed a settlement with Ethel, paid them $20 million of taxpayers' money, and allowed MMT back into the gasoline in Canada. So we have a foreign company with no accountability whatsoever to Canadian taxpayers overturning a law passed by our sovereign Parliament of Canada. And there's a U.S. health study being done on the impact of MMT. They came to Toronto to study the impact of MMT because MMT is coming out of the tailpipes of automobiles in Toronto, and of course it's not in Europe or the U.S. The Myers case, this was a case of the export of PCBs when we signed an international agreement prohibiting the transport or movement of PCBs. There was a company in the United States that was taking PCBs from Canada. They sued and overturned our law on the banning the transport or movement of toxic wastes. The metal-clad case was a case where the private California company sued Mexico because the citizens in Mexico didn't want to have a toxic waste dump run in their area. The state government declared it an ecological area, and metal-clad sued the Mexican government and won. One of the biggest cases is the Sunbelt case that's still before the panels. This is a California company that's suing Canada because of British Columbia's ban on the bulk export of water. They want to overturn that. And of course, the case that I'm sure you all know about is the UPS case. UPS is suing the Canadian government because they claim that Canada Post is subsidized by the Canadian government. These cases are not heard in Canadian courts. They're not even heard publicly. These are private tribunals behind closed doors using NAFTA law. The same principle as these overreaching security provisions, secret hearings, that the Canadian taxpayer pays the freight. The Canadian taxpayer paid Ethel their $20 million, and the Canadian taxpayer doesn't even have a right to hear or know what's gone on in those panels. So I find these profoundly undemocratic and anti-democratic provisions. They've had a powerful impact, a chill on all Canadian law. Every law that's passed now by any level of government in Canada is vetted to make sure it's NAFTA compatible. This is happening in the provincial level, it's happening at the municipal level, and it's of course happening at our federal level. Sometimes it's not even necessary for these U.S. companies to sue Canada. For example, the Time Warner case, when Sheila Copps was introducing her magazine legislation, Time Warner just threatened. They didn't actually file an action. And as we know, Sheila Copps backed off from her proposed magazine legislation. So to me, this has nothing to do with free trade. We didn't get free trade in these agreements. As we all know, I remember as a farmer, they promised us we'd have secure access to the largest, richest market in the world for our beef and for all of these other products that we sell. Well, now we have, of course, the 27% tariff on softwood lumber. We've got the border closed completely on beef. We've got tariff on our wheat. We've got actions against steel. So we didn't get free trade, but instead we got these provisions that give the United States huge new powers to access our energy, and private American corporations huge new powers to change the laws in Canada. That's why I've called for a review of the impact of these trade agreements, including the operation of Chapter 11. In fact, that was the second point of my agreement with Peter MacKay. Some of you might remember at the last leadership convention of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, which no longer exists, but we agreed that we would do a review of the impact of these agreements because their negotiations are now underway for a NAFTA Plus agreement. And the NAFTA agreement is, of course, the basis for the negotiations that are going on for the free trade area of the Americas. But John Manley is spearheading on the Canadian side the talks that are going on with the United States and Mexico for the so-called NAFTA Plus agreement, which the National Post tells us will essentially mean the erasing of the borders between Canada and the United States. Before we step into a NAFTA Plus agreement, I think we should review what we've already signed, and I think we should review the impact of that. We now have each province trading more with the states to the south of them than we are with each other. And so we had the Premier of Quebec, Mr. Lucien Bouchard, when he was Premier, went down to the United States and told the Americans, Quebec now trades more with the states to the south of it than we do with the rest of the Canadian provinces, so why does Quebec need the rest of the country? And what we've done is exactly what John A. MacDonald warned us about by cutting the east-west links. We've turned them north and south, and we now have the trade lines moving north and south. Okay, 2 more minutes. And this has an impact on Canada is a large, far-flung nation, and unless we have a vision of building industries in this country, we're not going to have it. I'm a farmer. I can't even buy a made-in-Canada combine anymore. The combine's $350,000. The John Deere combine coming from the United States, the profits go there. In the movie industry, 98% of the films in this country are foreign, less than 2% of the cinema screen time is Canadian. We don't even have a shipbuilding industry anymore, even though we're the nation with the longest coastline in the world. Our shipyards on the east and west coast are sitting idle while we import ships from abroad. So on all of these points, we need to have a conscious national policy to build industries in this country, and instead of that, we replaced it with these trade agreements that have become the new national policy. In fact, the NAFTA has become what I've often said is the new Constitution of Canada, because it's more rigorously enforced in our own Constitution, because if we contradict our own Constitution, we're not going to suddenly get a lawsuit from a powerful corporation south of the border, making sure that we get back in line. So, in terms of, instead of giving up our domestic market, chasing the dream of secure access in the U.S. market, there's only one secure market any nation has, that's so its own internal domestic market, and that's what we've given up by signing these agreements, and I think we should take a very serious look before they're expanded in any way. Thanks very much.
I told you this was going to be good.
Thank you very much, Larry, and thank you, Robert, and thank you, David. As you know, this panel is entitled The Future of NAFTA Chapter 11 and Bilateral Investment Treaties, BITs. I'm going to be focusing more on BITs, if you will, which are often also referred to as FIPAs. And I'm sorry to bore you with the acronyms, but FIPA is the Foreign Investment Protection and Promotion Agreement, FIPA. And as Robert mentioned, Canada has over 20 FIPAs. There are over 20,000 of these BITs circulating around the world. And I think you need to keep that in mind when you're considering NAFTA Chapter 11. Before I move into BITs, though, let me just comment on what David just said, because I want to make sure you understand how many claims there have been made under NAFTA Chapter 11 and how many actual decisions have been rendered. Because as lawyers, or about to be lawyers, we all know there's a difference between a nuisance claim and actually going to court and getting money for your client. Last month, an organization in the United States called Public Citizen, some of you may have heard of, Ralph Nader started it in the early 70s. They published a very good compendium, if you will. It's called NAFTA Chapter 11 Investor State Cases. And they list all the states. I'm not going to bore you with the figures other than this. The NAFTA's been around now for 11 years, and in all 3 countries, during those 11 years, 42 cases have been brought. So about, call it 4 a year. And this is in all 3 countries: Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And I'm going to give you these numbers in U.S. figures, because the organization Public Citizen, they're based in Washington, D.C. $28 billion have been claimed in these 42 cases over the last 11 years. Now, as a lawyer, you're going to be judged on your win-loss record, not on how many cases you bring, but how many you win. Of those 42 cases, 5 have gone the distance. 5 out of 42, about 12%. Of those 5 cases, $35 million has been awarded out of the $28 billion in claims. So I want you to be very, very careful. When you hear people talk about NAFTA Chapter 11 and they say people are attacking, people are making claims, you always have to ask the question as well, how many went the distance? Now, David mentioned to you the case of Sunbelt versus Canada. Claim was launched October 12, 1999, 5 years ago. This is what public citizen Ralph Nader has to say. As of January 2005, the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade website claims that no valid claim has been submitted and no arbitration is proceeding, even though the investor occasionally claims the case is active. Bottom line is, a lot of these cases get launched, but they don't go anywhere. And I think that's very, very important to keep in mind. Let me switch gears off of NAFTA and let me go to BITs, FIPAs, or whatever. Again, I want to thank my friend Robert for pointing out that there are over 2,000 BITs circulating around the world. Canada has over 20. And what we've recently done is we've just recently changed the template for our BITs that we're going to go sign. And you may have noticed our International Trade Minister, Jim Peterson, has said, I want to sign one with China, I want to sign them with India, I want to sign them with developing countries. Why? Because that's how you manage risk. I want to give you a few concepts that I'm going to be coming back to in my presentation. The first and most important one is private property on the one hand and state sovereignty on the other hand, because they come together in a bit. And they come together in investor-state disputes. Investors with private property rights, states with state sovereignty, they're supposed to be pursuing the public interest. The second concept is a developed country on the one hand versus a developing country on the other hand. In the good old days, the way a FIPA or a BIT worked was it was a one-way street. The developed country invested in the developing country, and if the developing country did something to the developed country's investors, the developed country hammered the developing country. We were all happy with that. We were in the developed country. The NAFTA changed that. The NAFTA allowed a developed country to attack a developed country. And that's what I think my friend David is very concerned about. Is all of a sudden you have U.S. investors attacking Canada. 2 of the cases David mentioned, environmental cases. S.D. Myers, Ethel. The Minister of Environment at that time was Sheila Cox. Both cases. She had a certain concept of the role of the state, and she had a certain concept of private property. And that concept ran head-on into Canada's international trade obligations. And that created controversy. That created controversy. I want to also highlight the other thing, in addition to the existence of private property rights versus state sovereignty in developed countries versus developing countries, the issue of a relative right on the one side and an absolute right on the other hand. A relative right is such as national treatment. It's a relative right in that all we're saying is we will treat foreign investors no less favorably than we will treat Canadian investors. We're not saying that we're taking on extra obligations. We're just saying we won't discriminate. That's even controversial in Canada, because as you know, we have measures here where we want to give a leg up on the locals over the foreigners. Absolute rights, though, go further. They say, we don't care if you treat us equally. These rights you're going to have to apply to us as foreigners, even if you don't provide them to your local people. And that has created controversy. Why? In the United States of America, in their Constitution, they protect private property rights. Specifically, they are protected. In Canada, when we did the Charter, we left out property rights, specifically, because we have a different view of the state and private property. So you have a clash. My friend Robert indicated, why are people surprised that you have people from other countries applying international trade concepts and not Canadians. And that's a key point. What is happening is international trade has a different concept of private property than Canadians do, and it clashes when you have a NAFTA dispute. I also want to make sure you're aware of another concept, which is treaty architecture. You've probably heard there are top-down treaties, there are bottom-up treaties. And by top-down, I mean that you take on an obligation such as national treatment. It's a broad obligation. It's from the top down, but you can pull yourself out from the coverage by listing specific exceptions. There are also bottom-up treaties, and the bottom-up treaty says it doesn't apply to me unless I write on a piece of paper that I agree that it will apply to a certain sector. The reason I say this to you is beware of broad statements about treaties. Beware. Why? Yes, there's a top-down principle that says we have to treat foreigners exactly the same way we treat Canadians. But read the fine print. There are annexes, there are subsections, and there are paragraphs where Canada pulls certain things off the table. Why? Again, you have private property rights and state sovereignty coming into play. Now, with that in mind, I want to give you one last thing to think about, and that is substance versus process. A lot of the criticisms you hear about investment treaties is the process, the dispute resolution process. Why is it an arbitration proceeding? Why do we have these foreigners? Why is it closed? And the quick answer is, as my friend Robert pointed out, is that's how it's been done over many centuries. That is the procedure that has been adopted. It wasn't just dreamed up with the NAFTA. Is that the best way to go? You'll see in the new FIPA, things are changing significantly. Individuals now can file amicus briefs. It's a more transparent process. Why is that? Because there are a lot of people upset, particularly in Canada, that you're having issues that people think deal with the public interest dealt with in a purely private proceeding. Let me just make sure we all understand why we have these investment treaties. And I think they're important because they define investor rights. You tell people, these are the rules. You want to put your money in the country? These are the rules. You can come in or stay out, but you got to know the rules coming in. And they provide a means for managing disputes between a foreign investor and a host country. And they can make a host country a more attractive place to invest, because by defining the rules and establishing the dispute resolution procedures, investment treaties can reduce uncertainty, and they can help manage one of the key concerns of any investor, and you all know what that is. It's risk, uncertainty. You want to know what the rules are before you go in. Can they treat the locals better than they treat me? I want to know that, because if they can, maybe I don't want to put my money into Canada. I don't have to put my money into Canada to ship my goods into Canada. We belong, as David pointed out, we are members of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and its successor, the World Trade Organization, and we've reduced our tariffs. That means that you don't have to put a plant in Canada in order to sell in Canada. And now David mentioned to you that there has been a lot of inward investment. Yes, a lot of Canadian companies have been purchased, but there's been a tremendous amount of outward investment. There has also been a lot of Canadian companies going around the world buying other companies. And they're the ones that want these investment treaties. They're saying to the government of Canada, I want an investment treaty. I don't want to invest in Russia and end up like that poor individual that we all saw this morning in a cage after my investment gets expropriated. I want to have a treaty, and I don't trust the local court system. I want to have the right to have an arbitrator, a neutral body, apply rules that I know what they are. And that is what our companies are requesting. There's no doubt that the NAFTA is very controversial because of the investor-state dispute provisions. But as I said, there's only been 5 cases that have gone the distance. 3 of them were in Canada. And again, in U.S. figures, the claims against Canada in those cases that my friend David mentioned, Ethel, S.D. Myers, and Pope and Talbot was another one. The claim was over 650 million US, and they got less than 20 US. This is over a period of 11 years. So I want you to keep that in perspective, and I also want you to keep in mind that our companies want them as well. This is not just the Yankees coming in here and saying to Canada, these are the rules, you've got to adhere to them. These are Canadian companies that want to invest overseas saying, we need a treaty or we can't put our money into a mine in Russia or another investment in a place such as Costa Rica. Let me leave you with one thought, because I'm into my 2-minute red zone. And that is, a lot of the time the debate on the treaty is ideologically driven. If you don't like private property, you're not going to like Chapter 11. If you don't like multinational corporations, you're not going to like Chapter 11. But I think what you have to do as international trade lawyers is you've got to, when you're looking at the treaty, read it, understand the concepts that I've just laid out. What's a relative right? What's an absolute right? What's a top-down architecture? What's a bottom-up architecture? And what are the actual obligations in the treaty? And I'll end this just by saying to you, it is all in the fine print. It is all in the fine print. No country, Canada included, no country is prepared to abdicate all of its sovereignty for an investment treaty. And so you have this delicate balancing between private rights and public rights. It's not black and white. It's a balance. And ideologically, we can all disagree on whether globalization is good or is globalization bad. Or we can all disagree on whether private property is good or big government is good. But as lawyers, I think you have to look at the treaty for what it is. So thank you very much, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Well, I think we all agree that we've had a tremendous set of presentations and the basis for good discussion. One of the things we want to do is have that discussion. And so the floor is open to questions. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Patrick Fothergill. Thank you very much. I agree. All three presentations have given me a lot to think about. And I want to pick one thing from each of them and ask you a question about, which is just filling me in on some data that I don't think has come out. Robert mentioned that one of the motivations for these treaties was to make sure that companies in smaller, less powerful countries were able to seek redress for the actions, the politically heavy actions of larger, more powerful countries. Am I right that you said something like that? Yeah. Okay. And David mentioned a lot of the claims that have been filed, or also sort of the chill that has been put on certain kinds of domestic policy or out of, sort of non-arbitrated settlements for potential claims that were being threatened. And James mentioned, that we have to be very careful to look at the actual numbers. And so what I'd like to know is, to what extent have this goal of allowing companies in smaller, less powerful countries to seek this kind of redress, has that happened? And contrarily, to what extent have these sort of chill effects, in measurable ways, do we have sort of figures on how the chill effects or non-arbitrated claims settled out of the panel process, how those numbers step out?
I think Jim said that there have been 5 cases that have gone to distance. Just to clarify what that means, there have been 5 cases in which an investor has been successful. There have been a number of other cases notably against the United States, and also cases against Mexico, where the investor has lost completely. Out of these 5 cases, one of these cases was a settlement that happened after a very basic jurisdictional finding was upheld in favor of the investor. One of the factors behind that settlement was, this is an ethyl case, was that the province of Alberta and the province of Quebec had complained about the law that had been passed, and an internal Canadian agreement, known as an Agreement on Internal Trade, had found in favor of the provinces and had recommended that the federal government approve the legislation. So not only you can draw much of a conclusion from that. Out of the 4 remaining cases, you have against Canada, you have SD Myers, which was a family-run business, fewer than 500 employees. You had Pope & Talbot, which was a publicly traded company. It was a larger company, but Pope & Talbot eventually got about $500,000 US, so not a huge amount. Against Mexico, you had Metalclad, a family-run business, fewer than 500 employees. The other successful claim against Mexico was not even a corporation, it was an individual, Mr. Feldman Carpa, who I think has just succeeded before the Ontario Court of Appeal after Mexico not only fought him vigorously throughout the arbitration, but then took him for judicial review in the Ontario courts where the place of arbitration was, and took him all the way up to the Court of Appeal. So if you look at the track record of who's really been benefiting out of this, one individual, 2 family-run businesses. These, I don't want to take up all the time here. I want to leave a little bit for other panelists, but just a few points of clarification. When Jim said there's 42 cases, there were 42 notices of intent filed under NAFTA. A notice of intent is actually not a case. It's just a form letter. And it's just a form letter that's designed to alert the relevant government official that somebody is invoking the treaty. You don't have to pay anything to send a notice of intent. You do have to actually pay something when you're starting an arbitration. So it's misleading, I think, to talk about 42 cases. There have actually far fewer cases. As I said, only 5 of those have resulted in payout. So, I'll talk about other issues perhaps later if I have a chance, but I'll let perhaps Mr. Orchard comment.
Thank you very much. One of the disadvantages of going before your other panelists is the last one gets to make comments that you'd love to respond to. So on this issue of whether you like private property, I don't know whether that was directed at me or not, but I'm a 4th generation farmer in Saskatchewan. We just celebrated the 100th anniversary of our farm, so nobody has accused me of being against private property. But what I don't like is these agreements that transcend our domestic law. And I think this is an excellent question that Mr. Fothergill just put up. What's happened? Well, let's look at what's happened to a couple of the Canadian companies that tried to use this. The Methanex case in California, which was really a very similar case to the ethyl case, which, as I pointed out, and Robert agrees, that we lost that. It overturned our legislation. Well, okay, you don't need to agree. Well, we overturned our legislation, and we lost. It didn't even go to a final panel. So, but in California, we lost completely. Without belaboring the point, if we take a look at the Lowen case, that was another Canadian case launched in the United States, which turned out to be a complete disaster for Mr. Lowen. If you followed, he ended up, as I understand it, in bankruptcy out of it. So size matters. And what's turning out is the United States is much more powerful, and the United States is having an impact. They won the Metalclad case against Mexico. And if I can just respond to this thing about how many cases have actually gone to panel, the 5, it doesn't matter. The point is whether these companies get what they want. They don't have to go. And then the point I was making with Time Warner is they just brandish the stick. And you remember when New Brunswick was talking about introducing a state provincial automobile insurance like we have in Saskatchewan, where I pay, $425 a year for my car insurance. Well, they backed away from that awful quickly, didn't they, in New Brunswick? Because they don't want to get sued under a NAFTA Chapter 11 panel, which they will get sued very, very quickly if they dare to introduce, say, the public auto insurance like we have in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and in British Columbia. So the issue is not, you don't have to win every time, you win once or twice, that's enough, and after that the threat is good enough. And if I can just respond to this issue about Canadian companies wanting this in Russia or somewhere else, this NAFTA Chapter 11 is the first time that private foreign companies have been given the right to sue the Canadian government. This doesn't exist anywhere else. It doesn't exist under GATT. It doesn't exist under the World Trade Organization. It doesn't exist under these hundreds of other treaties that my co-panelists have been talking about. But it exists under NAFTA, where private foreign companies have, Mexican and Canadian and American companies have greater rights in Canada than Canadian companies.
Let me just comment. I don't agree with that last concept. I mean, you're all lawyers. You can take a look at the 2,000 bits that are out there. And you can all determine whether there are provisions in there that allow private individuals to sue states. Let me, just before I respond to Patrick's question, I want to make sure that, and Robert's correct, let me just go through these cases. There are 42 letters have been sent, and I agree with Robert there. 42 have been sent. 5 cases, and when I say gone the distance, that means a lawyer actually got some money for his client. 5 cases amounted in awards. 6 cases were won by the governments. So, in other words, out of these 42, 11 cases actually went somewhere. 5 were won by the private investors, 6 were won by the government. There are 11 cases currently proceeding, whatever that means, because as you saw, David just mentioned that these corporations get what they want, but Sunbelt, which was started over 5 years ago, last time I looked, what they were looking for was BC Water, and they don't have BC Water as we speak. There are, as I said, there's 11 cases out there that are still running around. 6 have been won by the state, 5 have been won by individual investors, and if you do the arithmetic, that means there's 20 of these letters that were written, and then nothing happened. The letter was written, the arbitration never happened. I don't know about you, but if this was that powerful a tool, one would think that you wouldn't have half of the 42 letters going out just disappearing. And the fact is, a lot of these are nuisance. Let me follow on to one last thing, and I wanted to address your question, Patrick, and that is, who's using this? And this is interesting because last Tuesday, Public Citizen issued a press release, and you'll like this one. Canadian Cattlemen's NAFTA Challenge, demanding U.S. taxpayer compensation for mad cow import restrictions, is latest example of trade models' assault on democratic policymaking, vital consumer safeguards. You've got a bunch of farmers, these are beef farmers, these are farmers that farm in a free trade market who've had their access to the United States of America closed. And they feel that Ottawa, the government of Canada, is not doing enough for them, and they are using NAFTA Chapter 11, these beef farmers, to attack the United States of America. So the idea that it's only the big guys going against the little guys, I think that that's belied. And
Who do you think that's winning?
well, David, I got to tell you, 5 out of 42, that's not a big guy. And I'm not going to go over what Robert just pointed out factually regarding who the people were bringing these cases.
Time Warner.
Well, last time I looked, that wasn't even part of the 42, David.
That's right. They just threatened it.
They threatened what?
The magazine legislation pops back off.
Well, David, I don't agree with your characterization of the facts. That's not what happened. I acted on that case, and that's not what happened.
Why was the magazine legislation dropped?
Why was the magazine legislation dropped? The magazine legislation, I think, was dropped because Canada, under our treaty obligations, we've agreed to treat foreigners the same way as we treat Canadians. And if you've got a problem with that, if what you're saying is we should allow foreign investment into Canada but we should have the right to treat foreigners less than we treat Canadians. That's your point of view. I personally don't agree with it. And I personally don't think that if I'm an investor, a Canadian investor going into another country, if that country says, come on in here, but we'll screw you and treat you less than we treat our locals, I don't think that I'm going to want to invest in that country.
Yeah, but Canada, listen, Canada is 1/10 the size of the United States. We have always had a policy, if we don't look after our people, we're going to get walked over. And this idea that, oh, we can all be equal now, it doesn't work. In the real world, some people have bigger sticks and are taller than others.
In the real world, David, we have a trade surplus with the United States of America. The thing I don't understand is we have a trade surplus with the United States of America. They gave us access to a market 10 times bigger than what we have, and we have a surplus, and we have people saying we got the raw end of the stick. I'm missing something here. The Americans got access to a much smaller market than we did. So I don't agree with you, David. I don't agree with you. Government on their promise on taxes, and I think the court basically said, why would anybody believe a politician? I hate to say it, but that's where we are. That's where we are. I agree with you that each country, when they negotiate a treaty, will try to negotiate that treaty in their best interests, and I would hope that Canada does that. And Canada, I think, has done a very effective job negotiating treaties. I've had the pleasure of working with people in the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade and being in international fora with our negotiators. And Canada's negotiators are second to none. We don't go into a room and get rolled over. Canada is very highly respected in international trade negotiations. I'll just say one last thing, and that is, I think anybody involved in the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement realizes that Canada threw way more resources into that negotiation than the Americans did. We had a much bigger negotiating team with far more authority. We had Simon Reisman. They had Peter Murphy. Simon Reisman was a very seasoned negotiator. I think he was in his 60s at that time, whereas Peter Murphy was more of a kind of a guy in the middle of his career. The Americans did not treat that negotiation as seriously as we did, and I think we did very well on it. And I rest my case by looking at the fact that we run trade surpluses with the United States. We sell more to them than they sell to us.
If I could just respond to that.
Sure.
This idea of trade surpluses being a great thing, let's look at some of them. Our exports of energy have risen dramatically. All of the petroleum going out of the tar sands in Alberta is going south across the border at a 0% royalty. That's 0%. And for Mr. McGilroy and others to trumpet this as a great triumph for Canada, we're going to run out of energy. Our reserves are limited, they're finite, and yet we're sending them south, that huge new pipeline, the Alliance pipeline out in British Columbia running through my province, Saskatchewan, taking that raw gas south straight to Chicago. We're not even stripping out the byproducts anymore that we used to do in Alberta. So to trumpet this is something great. Let's look at our standard of living. We were told our standard of living would rise if we signed these trade agreements. It's fallen since. We used to be at the top of the UN's list of best countries in the world in which to live. Norway has replaced us. Norway, which has refused to enter the European Union. They've stayed outside. They had 2 referendums on it, and they voted twice to stay out, and they trade around the world, as we can do, but they've kept in their own hands the right to use their resources for their own ends. And of course, they don't allow foreign ownership to take the majority position in their oil and gas sector. We've done just the opposite, and our standard of living is falling. And if I can just mention a word about agriculture, Mr. McElroy says that we have the greatest negotiations. Let's look at who is negotiating in agriculture. First, our trade minister said agriculture wasn't going to be part of this free trade agreement. When we got it, it's the longest section in it, 58 pages. And who is negotiating? On the U.S. side, Daniel Amstutz from Cargill Investor Services, advising the U.S. government. On the Canadian side, David Gilmore from Cargill Grain Canada, advising the Canadian government. So here you have the largest grain company in the world sitting on both sides of the table, and it's no surprise they got exactly what they wanted out of it. And look what's happened to our grain industry, moving wholesale into U.S. hands. The Alberta Wheat Pool, Manitoba Wheat Pool, all move now under the control of ADM, including and also United Grain Growers. and our entire flour milling industry across the country gone into U.S. hands. The only thing that's left keeping some Canadian agriculture industry in Canadian hands is the Canadian Wheat Board, and the U.S. has specifically targeted saying that their goal is to get rid of the Canadian Wheat Board.
I just want to interject to say we're trying to keep this focused on NAFTA Chapter 11. I know that there are lots of issues that concern people about the NAFTA in general, but let's try and keep this to the investment provisions, because that's what the session is all about. There was a question.
Somebody
Sir.
could speak to the environmental complications due to foreign investment.
Well, can we have, let's have a brief response to that.
Just what I'll do is, there's a lot of issues raised by your question. Some of them are political, economic issues dealing with trade agreements, regardless of whether there's an investment chapter in them or not. So what I would like us to do is to raise issues of environmental concerns, but this was mentioned a lot in David's comments, and talk about the law and about cases, because this is, after all, a law students' conference, and talk about the small number of cases that have dealt with environmental issues under NAFTA Chapter 11. And when I hear the description of how Chapter 11 works, sometimes I feel like I'm almost a little bit in one of those fun houses with distorted mirrors, and there's a certain element of reality there, but it's either you're looking at yourself way too long or way too wide, and what I'm trying to do is just kind of clarify a little bit and bring the focus back towards what's actually going on. You have had really, out of all these cases, there have been two decisions on the merits of dealing with environmental issues. One, the S.D. Myers case, and the second, the Metalclad case. So there's been only two decisions on the merits. Most cases have actually not dealt with environmental issues at all. Out of these two decisions on the merits, where the investor has been successful, the amount of damages has been very small. We're talking about, against Canada, it was about $6.5 million plus interest and cost. It turned out to be about $9 million. Against the U.S., against Mexico, it was $16 million. This is in the course of 11 years, and when you average that out in terms of a yearly basis, in terms of how much is actually being spent by the government of Canada defending claims, it's really a rounding error compared to how much the government of Canada spends trying to promote Canada as a place to invest around the world. And I think that it's probably a much more effective use of money in terms of promoting Canada as a place to invest than other means. So, because I was going to talk about law, let's talk about S.D. Myers. S.D. Myers was a case where Sheila Copse's own bureaucrats at the Ministry of Environment told her there's no environmental basis for imposing the export ban on PCB waste. They actually thought it was harmful to the environment to impose the export ban on PCB waste, because what S.D. Myers was doing was cleaning up PCB waste in Canada, bringing it south to the United States, and the PCBs actually traveled much shorter distances, and the services for cleanups were actually available at much lower cost than what was being the case in Canada. Canada was dominated by a monopoly based in Alberta. If you had PCB waste in Windsor, you had to ship it out to Alberta and pay monopoly prices. That monopoly, however, went to Sheila Copse and said, hey, there's somebody taking my business away, and can you do something to stop that? And so she said, well, I want to have Canada for Canadians, and I don't want to have an American entrant competing against Canadians. I'm going to impose an export ban on this. It had nothing to do with a real environmental problem. And that's what the tribunal said was the violation of national treatment in that case. In Metalclad, you had a situation where both the state and federal governments of Mexico told Metalclad that they could build a waste treatment plant in Mexico. Metalclad relied on those promises and invested $16 million in Mexico. After it had done so, the municipality refused to give it a construction permit. Why? Because there was pressure. Nobody wants a waste management plant in their backyard. So the municipality said, we're refusing to give you a construction permit. And there was no construction problem. It was simply they didn't like the decisions being taken by other levels of the Mexican government on environmental issues. That was found to be a violation by the tribunal, although it was later set aside on judicial review. What was upheld was a ban that was then imposed later on in the whole Melclad saga by the state government, where they declared that this area where Melclad had built its plant was a rare cactus reserve. There were apparently no rare cacti in that area, but leave that aside. In Canada, if you would have an area being designated as a public park, the Canadian property owner would, under Canadian law, be entitled to compensation for expropriation in that type of situation. So it's hardly a radical concept. It is true that the government of Canada has no constitutional restraints on deciding not to compensate people for expropriation. But as a practical matter, that's generally what happens when land is expropriated. So these are hardly the most radical, threatening types of cases, and obviously
Well, I agree with Mr. Weisner on one thing, that it's like looking in a funny mirror to hear some of these discussions. Let's talk about these cases. When Mr. Weisner says only $6 million has been awarded, neither he nor Mr. McGilroy talked about the Ethel case. The Ethel case didn't go to a final award, but Canada paid $19.7 million to Ethel. So it wasn't necessary to get to the final case. Ethel got a complete victory, including a letter from Canada that they had no knowledge of there being detrimental effects to MMT. Ethel wanted this to peddle around the world, and they got it. And they got our ban overturned. The Metalclad case, this is a U.S. company suing the government in Mexico for $92 million, by the way, and the citizens of the area protesting with machetes in their hands and getting the government to support them, their own government, and they set up the area, called it an ecological reserve, said they didn't want this facility there. So Metalclad sues, and they get their award. They end up appealing it into the British Columbia courts, which adjusted the award, but they won. So this questioner, they're talking about environmental cases. The environment has been a key factor in these cases. And the S.D. Myers case was another case. It wasn't that Sheila Kopp suddenly got this brainwave she wants to stick up for Canada. We signed the Basel Convention prohibiting the trans-border movement of waste, and Canada attempted to implement an international environmental treaty, and it ran smack up against NAFTA, and NAFTA won. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the trumping of environmental law, environmental regulations, by these trade agreements that are being won by private foreign investors. And my point about all this is that if Canada should have the right to govern itself, to pass its own environmental laws without having to be worried about getting sued by private American corporations that don't happen to like our environmental laws. So I think that's the basic issue. And the one thing I'll agree with both of my panelists on is I think these trade agreements are very good things for lawyers, but not necessarily very good things for countries.
Hear, hear. Well, we have time for one or two more questions, but I can't resist a couple of comments. One is, and I'm not trying to jump in because I think the panelists have engaged in this exercise very well. But when we talk about the NAFTA and Canada-U.S. relations, I think as lawyers, many of us, David, you'll forgive us, are lawyers, we're talking about the rule of law. We're talking about establishing a system of rules based on law governing a relationship that happens to be the most important relationship that Canada has. And so while it may not be perfect, it strikes me as a lawyer that Canada as a country is always better off pursuing a relationship that is based on law than one that is based on pure raw power. And I think we're better served curbing the power of our American friends through rules than being subject to the whims of congressional or Senate committee. The other comment I would make is that one of the factors in Chapter 11 disputes is this. Any company that wants to bring a Chapter 11 case is going, and that's a private company, a private interest, is going to be taking on the full range of governmental resources. That's a daunting task. And what I mean by that is any private interest that sues the Canadian government, and UPS is a good example of that, is going to be faced with the enormity of state resources in defending that case. And the UPS case, which David Orchard has mentioned, has been going on for many years and is far from seeing the light of day. There have been many interstitial motions in that case. UPS has taken on the full authority of the Canadian government, and no government, in my experience, no government is going to, when faced with a serious Chapter 11 case, back off. And so any entity that is expecting to do future business in the country that they want to sue should think twice about bringing a case. I believe that has had a major dampening impact on these Chapter 11 cases. Because normally an investor with something at issue wants to stay in the country and wants to do future business in the country. And if it's a regulated entity, it better beware, because if it sues the government that regulates it, it may have some future problems. And that's a practical factor. Anyway.
Mr. Chairman, I want to invoke my right of response here.
Yeah.
Seeing as the chair stepped into the debate, I would like to reply a little bit to this.
I was trying to be neutral.
On the rule of law, if I might, I have never quibbled with the rule of law, and I would like to point out that we dealt with the United States on the basis of GATT, WTO law since the 1940s. The rule of law has reigned in our trading relationship, and I'm an advocate of going back to the GATT, WTO, under which we did much better than we're doing under an arrangement with our one-on-one with our powerful neighbor. And so it's not a question of being, as Mr. Chairman says, we're always better off pursuing the rule of law against our powerful neighbor. I'm saying we're much better off in a multilateral forum where there's 120 odd countries around the world that are part of it that can help us than stepping right into a relationship with one other country 10 times bigger than us that owns much of our economy already and ends up clobbering us in these arrangements. So it's not that I'm against the rule of international law. I'm all in favor of it.
Well, I agree. I agree
Close it
with
to the
you.
mic because we're recording it. We really want to get all this.
Well, some of it you may not want to record. Don't forget, when you talk about the WTO as the ideal, and the WTO...
I didn't talk about his ideals, but warts and all is better than
Warts and all, better than others. Don't forget, it's the WTO that turned down Canada's position on periodicals. We lost the WTO on the periodicals case. Time magazine, you remember all of that? WTO ruled against us. Okay.
Dairy export subsidies we lost as well.
Yeah, so we lose at the WTO. Interestingly, NAFTA panels have been almost uniformly supportive of our, NAFTA panels have been supportive of our position on softwood lumber.
Okay, good, if I can respond to that. Under the WTO and under GATT, there is no right of private foreign corporations to sue the Canadian government. Warts and all, and I agree that we've lost some cases in front of the WTO and the GATT, although in the cases, the 9 cases that went in front of GATT from 1940 up till the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, we were successful on 8 out of the 9, so our track record was much better. But the bigger picture is that under the WTO and GATT, we still have the right to pass laws, environmental laws in our country without worrying about being sued by a foreign corporation. And this right of this Chapter 11 of NAFTA is unique in that under NAFTA, these private corporations can sue us. They can't do that under the GATT and the WTO.
David wants to take away the right of our cattlemen to go after Uncle Sam.
That's nonsense.
And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. David, listen.
Sure, go ahead, then I'll respond to you.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But I'd like to give you a website that I'll just read it out very briefly. www.citizen at citizen.org. That's Ralph Nader's outfit. And last time I looked, Ralph was not exactly pro corporations, but I commend this document to you. There's a lot of spin on it, but it is a very good compendium as to how many cases have been brought, who won what, etc. But the bottom line is, it's over 100 pages, and this is how the press release ends. And I'll just read it to you briefly, and then I'll allow my friend David to reply. They excoriate Chapter 11 for over 100 pages. Here's the conclusion. The United States has not yet lost a case, thanks to an array of lucky technical breaks. However, it's just a matter of time before a NAFTA claim is successful against the United States. My point is this, is if you look at the numbers, and I think my friend Robert, who understands these cases probably better than anybody in this country because he's been very deeply involved in them, and when you actually go through the facts, this criticism of Chapter 11 of the NAFTA and of bilateral investment treaties is much ado about nothing. It really is. There's not much there. There are a lot of guys who write these 42 letters, and then as Larry says, when they go in to see a lawyer and say, bring the case, and they're advised of what the legal fees will be and their chances of success, over half of them don't go anywhere. The ones that do go anywhere, the ones that David's talked about in Canada, where they claim over 650 US and they get less than 20 million, I've got to tell you, I'm not in a big hurry to advise my clients that this is a course of action that they should be taking. It is very difficult to sue a sovereign state. It is very difficult because they're big, they can wait you out, and they can run up your legal fees. So this idea that somehow these Chapter 11 disputes have emasculated sovereign states, I just don't buy that. I just don't buy that.
Well, if I can just...
Well, David, just...
I just want to make one point to thank Mr. McGilward for making my point. The United States has not yet lost a case. Now, Ralph Nader, a friend of mine, we spoke jointly against the NAFTA in that battle, and Nader is right. The United States has not yet lost a case. So if we're talking about websites, I'll point you to one too, davidorchard.com.
Now, we've got time for a couple more questions. Sir, you've been very patient. Jordan is here. When Jordan appears, I have to run for cover and make sure that I toe the line. What time? Have we got time for a couple more questions?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
2 or 3 more questions.
2 or 3 more questions. Sure.
Thank you. My name's Gordon Hansi. I too am from Saskatchewan.
Yay.
I would like to ask, under circumstances where the Lowen case having been mentioned, what gives consortiums and large corporations the right to own and sell and have the right for the person that purchases and replenishes that to have exclusive authority over the individual? I'm talking about grain, the corn that was mentioned in the next room, and Mr. Lowen in Saskatchewan, who apparently didn't buy any of the seeds. It wasn't proven that they didn't blow on his land.
Miser, not Lowen.
Sorry, Mr. Smizer. Thank you. It's the same difference, regardless of who it is. And if these corporations elect not to sell to anyone, you cannot buy, if you are growing that grain, from or sell to your neighbor. The long-range indication...
Sir, is there a question?
Yes, the long-range
Let's put the
indication
question,
to me is that they will control our food supply. Who gave them that authority is the question. Oh, David, you mentioned the wheat pools. You didn't mention that the Saskatchewan wheat pool is practically owned by the American man that's running it.
Well, I didn't detect that there was a question about Chapter 11, but let David answer it very briefly.
Okay. Well, the Saskatchewan wheat pool still isn't quite owned outside the country. You're right. There's an American team of managers running it. That's right. but the Alberta and the Manitoba pools and the United Grain Growers, ADM has the right to buy a controlling interest in those. You were talking about Percy Schmeiser. I mentioned the Lowen case, which was a funeral homes case under NAFTA, but the Schmeiser case you're talking about is the case of Percy Schmeiser growing his canola and then being accused by Monsanto for having their Roundup Ready canola in his fields. And they attempted to collect their royalty, which is $15 an acre, against Mr. Schmeiser. He said, "I never planted your seed, I'm not going to pay you a royalty." And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Court of Appeal ruled, and it was upheld at the Supreme Court, that it didn't matter how those seeds got on Mr. Schmeiser's land. It was the responsibility of the farmer, because he had seeds that contained the genes that Monsanto had patented in them, and they therefore had a right of ownership. You ask where that comes from? That comes from the plant breeders legislation that we put in place. Flows out of that, and it flows out of this decision to patent human life forms. The Harvard mouse case in the U.S. Supreme Court, where they put the human genes in the mouse, they got a bigger, faster mouse, and then they were allowed to patent it. Thankfully, the Canadian Supreme Court didn't go down that road. They didn't, by 5-4 decision, they didn't go down that road. But in the Schmeiser case, also by 5-4, they ruled against Schmeiser in essence. So we have a situation where farmers have been put in a situation where we now have to essentially be responsible, and it's almost a return to a type of serfdom. How do we know? The only way you find out whether you've got Roundup Ready canola growing on your fields is by spraying some Roundup on and seeing if it dies. I happen to be an organic farmer, and I don't allow any Roundup on my property. But this Roundup Ready canola has now contaminated our entire canola industry. It's crossbred with the conventional. It's destroyed the organic industry, and this is the issue that's a big issue now. Monsanto wants to have the right of releasing their Roundup Ready alfalfa, which will be a major impact on farming. And they've done a number of studies to release Roundup Ready wheat. Thankfully, 20 of our customers around the world said they won't buy any wheat from us if they do release that, and so Monsanto has temporarily at least shelved that proposal.
Now, this is a little bit removed from Chapter 11, very interesting, but let's get back to Chapter 11. Yes, sir.
This is about BITs in general. Canada seems to be promoting them all. How do you think that accords with their supposed support for multilateral trade in general?
Canada has attempted to negotiate multilateral investment treaties. You'll probably recall under the umbrella of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, during the 90s, there was an initiative called the MAI, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. And it sparked tremendous controversy and went nowhere as a result. And David mentioned the World Trade Organization, the WTO, as well. There was a push underway at the WTO to pursue a multilateral investment treaty, and that didn't go anywhere. So the bottom line is that there have been attempts to negotiate multilateral investment treaties, but they haven't gone anywhere because the consensus at that level doesn't exist. And I think it's fair to say the last attempt in the WTO, the reason it broke down is the developing countries said, there's nothing in this for us. You know, we're going to be on the receiving end all the time. We receive investment, you're going to use this to clobber us, you developed countries, and we're not going there. And so typically what happens now is that Canada will negotiate on a case-by-case basis. Let me just leave you with one thought, and that is Jim Peterson, our current trade minister, is saying he wants to do a treaty with China. And one of the reasons he does is because we have companies who want to invest in China, and they're worried about what's going to happen. The interesting part is China wants to invest in Canada as well. And therefore, this new FIPA that we have is really a two-edged sword, where Canada is saying, we want to protect our investors when they go into China, but we don't want a Chinese investor hammering us. And so we're trying to strike a very delicate balance, because it's become a two-way street.
Ladies and gentlemen, not only is Jordan looking at me, but Zara has poked her head in. It's 6 o'clock, it's after 6. I know that there are a lot of questions, and we couldn't get to everybody, but It is 6 o'clock, it is Saturday, and there are drinks and reception outside. So I think we should regrettably end our session. And I'm sorry that if some people didn't get questions asked, but we've done our best. I want to take the opportunity to thank the panel. I think each of them have done us a great service in providing us with their views and their insights, and I think you'll all join with me in giving them a warm applause in appreciation.